Welcome to Voices in Action, a new podcast by the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living about disability in Oregon. I'm your host, Leo Alenak. Over the course of this first season, we'll cover a variety of topics related to disability justice education, speak with leaders of local advocacy organizations, and learn from one another in the process. This week, we'll be discussing disability and environmental justice from an Indigenous perspective. In the book, The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth by the Red Nation, the authors describe the importance of Indigenous sovereignty and knowledge in saving our planet. Quote, "There is no hope for restoring the planet's fragile and dying ecosystems without Indigenous liberation. This is not an exaggeration. It's the simple truth. Indigenous people understand the choice that confronts us, decolonization or extinction. We have unequivocally renewed our bonds with the earth, implementing intellectual traditions in the movements for decolonization. There is no turning back. These bonds are sacred and will never be broken. This is why Indigenous water protectors and land defenders throughout the world are criminalized and assassinated on a daily basis. We have chosen life, and therefore we have been marked for death. Despite this grim reality, Indigenous people continue to caretake the land, even under the threat of daily attack. The labor that Indigenous water protectors, land defenders, and treaty defenders perform is crucial to our species. We depend upon caretakers for both social and biological reproduction. Humanity would not exist without caretakers. But caretaking is labor. It takes work to plant crops. It takes work to hunt. It takes work to raise children. It takes work to clean homes. It takes work to break down a buffalo. It takes work to learn the properties of traditional medicine. Healing the planet is ultimately about creating infrastructures of caretaking that will replace infrastructures of capitalism. Capitalism is contrary to life. Caretaking promotes life. Caretaking is at the center of contemporary Indigenous movements for decolonization and liberation. We therefore look to these movements for guidance on building infrastructures of caretaking that have the potential to produce caretaking economies and caretaking jobs now and in the future. We also look to the infrastructure of caretaking that is currently emerging where capitalist nation-states have failed to save lives from COVID-19. Under the current system of global capitalism, caretaking is undervalued and often unrecognized as a form of labor. Caretakers like parents, land defenders, and water protectors make up a huge percentage of workers who produce the social and material means by which we live, yet they are not paid. In a world being reshaped by a pandemic, caretakers have become the most important sector of workers, not only by saving people's lives, but also keeping whole families and communities afloat. Mutual aid networks populated by caretakers are proliferating, providing relief to the most vulnerable, and paving the way for robust caretaking economies to replace the crumbling system of global capitalism. Current mutual aid networks are neither state-sanctioned or state-funded efforts. They are entirely people-led and the result of working-class solidarity between nurses, service providers, students, domestic workers, migrant farmers, and families. Mutual aid networks affirm life by caretaking for humanity rather than denying life by abandoning and exploiting humanity. The monumental challenge we face is how to turn caretaking labor into life-affirming mass movements that can topple global capitalism once the emergency conditions of the pandemic lift. Only when we are able to mount a real threat to the hegemony of global capitalism through such movements will we be able to heal the planet. Like the development of mass movements, affirming our relationship with the land is not optional if we wish to avoid extinction. This is not some mythical vision where we go out and hug trees. It is a serious agenda for decolonization that requires comprehensive land return programs and funding for mass, Indigenous-led land restoration projects. Health reciprocity with the environment also depends upon Indigenous people having unrestricted access to land, unencumbered by colonial borders and free of harassment from agents of the state. We understand the land is our means of production as Indigenous people. This is why decolonization and land return are not metaphors. Land is also the means of production for settler economies, which require property as a basic building block for amassing capital and power. We cannot successfully wage class war until Indigenous land repatriation is taken seriously as a precursor to seizing the means of production more broadly. U.S. imperialism, the greatest threat to the future of the planet, will never end if land remains in the hands of settler capitalists. The collective future of us all depends upon the ability of Indigenous caretakers to work with the land, restore its health, and reestablish balance in our relations. With threats like radioactive contamination, wildfires, chemical pollution, and biodiversity loss, we will also need to seek new and alternative technologies. This is something Indigenous people embrace because we have always been technological innovators, scientists, and engineers. But as we know, capitalists have a monopoly on technology, with the majority of the most advanced technologies being used for war efforts. Scientists are denied funding for projects that are not considered profitable or that directly disrupt the flow of capital to the already wealthy. What if technology was created for the benefit of all life on Earth? In order to answer this question, we must turn to indigenous knowledge. The following pages prove that our traditions of science, technology, and diplomacy are key to ensuring a future for all living beings on this planet. Trauma-informed thinking has taken over indigenous governments, institutions, nonprofits, revenue streams, and even movements. Like electoral politics, trauma-based healing sucks all the political and emotional energy out of the room, leaving little space for other possibilities and visions for change. The narrowing of our collective energies into trauma has come at the expense of building vibrant and militant struggles for liberation with other colonized and oppressed peoples of the world. Rather than allying with revolutionary movements in the global south to overturn U.S. imperialism once and for all, we argue on social media and academic panels about injury, who is more injured and who injures more. This is entirely a first world discourse. Movements outside the United States rarely traffic in the language of trauma and injury to develop political positions or tactics of organizing. What does it mean to take up healing as a revolutionary concept, one that transcends the neoliberal realm of individual trauma and allows us to imagine a world that prioritizes collective well-being and healthy relationships? In this time of a global pandemic, we must reclaim healing from the neoliberal individualism afforded to trauma and injury, and instead globalize our efforts. The Red Deal advocates for healing our bodies and the planet, but not from individual trauma alone. We must heal from colonialism and capitalism together. The cunning politics of injury has come to define our era, where state and corporate perpetrators of violence and genocide are asked to, or position themselves as purveyors of justice, while entirely sidestepping the question of colonialism and imperialism. Prior to this era of so-called reconciliation, liberation was on the horizon of struggle. Today, the horizon has become our further incorporation into the settler state and U.S. imperialism. Instead of finding a seat at the table, we ask that this table get off our lands. We are more defined by our dreams of liberation and freedom, and we refuse to be defined by trauma and violence narratives, as hapless subjects rather than active agents of history. Liberation and freedom, no less and no more, defines healing for us. COVID-19 is a harsh but crucial lesson about the need for collective healing, which will require militant movements to liberate the planet from systems and structures that target whole nations and species. Although there are many points of entry into this global struggle, there can be no doubt that indigenous movements for decolonization and liberation must be at the center of our collective efforts." End quote. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Lhui Whitebear, the Center Director of Kakuikst Manaina House and Assistant Professor for the School of Language, Culture, and Society at Oregon State University.
Yeah, Haku, my name is Lhui Whitebear. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Coastal Chumash with Huastec and Cochimi ancestry. I'm the Center Director over at the Kakuikst Manaina House at Oregon State University, and also going to be starting up some more formal teaching through assistant professor in the School of Language, Culture, and Society too pretty soon.
So what is OSU's Kakuikst Manaina House?
Yeah, the Ina House, as we call it for short, is one of 7 cultural resource centers on campus. The first one started way back in the early 70s, and it was the collective efforts of the Black Student Union, the Chicano Student Union, and the Native American Student Association. They built a shared cultural center that they used as a place to gather. The Ina House was the first center that came out of that space, and it was originally called the Native American Longhouse back then. And since then, there's been several other cultural resource centers that have come up on campus. They're primarily standalone spaces. Only one of them is within another building, and that's our Etahad Cultural Center. It's within the Student Experience Center, and it's great that there's that big collection of centers, and we focus at the Ina House on the Indigenous people of the Americas and Pacific Islands. And so we kind of look at how Indigenous identity transcends colonial borders and migration and shared spaces. There's shared histories with colonization and militarization, and there's also connections with the ocean as well as land. And so that's kind of a large group to represent, but most of the centers represent large masses of lands and waters. So that's the area that we kind of focus on. We do look really closely at our connection to the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes because we are on Kalapuya land, and the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to Coast reservations into what is now the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes back in 1855. And so we want to make sure we honor that, respect that, build relationships with the local tribes and the work that we do and how we talk about the history of the space as well.
So if you're comfortable sharing, what is your connection to the disability community?
Yeah, so my connection to the disability community is having disabilities myself and navigating what that means as far as my access to work and to being able to explore with my kids, and also having conversations about what it means to have disabilities. Because a lot of times when people see me, they read me as able-bodied and don't really think about the whole spectrum of what disabilities encompass. And even though I do have some physical parts of it as well, a lot of times folk I don't want to say like see it, because that almost feels ableist in itself, but like if it's not being read as what people like to like box people into what a disability looks like in a dominant framework. And so that's my connection to the community, and also helping people understand that talking about disabilities is something we should be doing, and also centering the needs of folk that need more support to help make spaces more accessible.
Can you talk then about navigating disability activism within communities of color, particularly Indigenous communities?
Yeah, a lot of times people look at Indigenous activism and think of it as only frontline resistance, because that's basically what Indigenous people have been doing since like contact. It's a long legacy of frontline resistance, and I have also participated in a lot of that sort of activism myself. But sometimes what happens is folk that are participating in activism in other ways aren't looked at as being activists when they are. And so whether that's doing policy work, or if that's teaching, or if that's working in the community, whether that's helping spread awareness through social media, there's so many different ways that activism happens. And sometimes it gets read as one-dimensional when people think about Indigenous activists too. And so I look at myself as like a different stage in my activism right now. And so like helping pass down some of the things I know to younger activists and older activists too, but just like figuring out where I'm at in life and what I can be involved with and what I can do. And so that's really helped me broaden how I think of activism. And actually what really helped was reading June Jordan's Life is Activism book and thinking about your life and the everyday moments and what you do as a form of activism and resistance as well. And I think for Indigenous people, that's especially important because it's been the policy of the settler state to eliminate us and strip us of who we are in all aspects of our life. And so that really helped ground me in this point in my life and like how I think about activism, and also being a mother and what that means as far as my availability and stuff. So I think the more that people think about the different ways that people can be involved in activism, the better, and not look at folk that aren't able to be on frontline resistant as not activists. And a lot of times that can end up being really ableist, right? Because if you think about participating in a march or being on a front line and being arrested and what all that entails, not everybody has that ability.
Yeah, for sure. I also have to imagine that there's something and by something I mean some kind of element of white supremacy that kind of manifests in the expectation of Indigenous people only as frontline activists, and kind of this fulfilling this expectation of this kind of imagery that we have in our minds, like for white guilt or white consumption, to see these pictures of like activists fighting, pipelines and things like that and getting arrested. And that's something that like, or when we see Black activists fighting the cops in the streets, like it's almost like this fulfilling thing of like, that's the extent of what activism is. And it also fulfills this expectation of like martyrdom, if that makes sense. While I lacked the language for it in the moment, what I was trying to describe was the effect of the colonial gaze, a term utilized by author John Ryder in the book Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction. Quote, although the reversal of perspective in Wells's War of the Worlds transposes the positions of colonizer and colonized, the framework of colonial relations itself remains intact in an important way. Wells switches the position of his white Western narrator from its accustomed, dominant, colonizing one to that of the dominated Indigenous inhabitant of the colonized land. This strategy makes not only the political, but also the cognitive effects of the framework of colonial relations visible in a tellingly distorted way. The narrator no longer occupies the position usually accorded to the scientific observer, but instead finds himself in that role historically occupied by those who are looked at and theorized about, rather than those who look, analyze, and theorize. We can call this cognitive framework establishing the different positions of the one who looks and the one who is looked at, the structure of the colonial gaze. The colonial gaze distributes knowledge and power to the subject who looks, while denying or minimizing access to power for its object, the one looked at. This structure, a cognitive disposition that both rests upon and helps to maintain and reproduce the political and economic arrangements that establish the subject's respective positions, remains strikingly present and effective in spite of the reversal of perspective in War of the Worlds. We spectators are placed in the quote-unquote realist position of onlookers at a scene that is wholly absorbed in itself, and therefore does not and cannot look back at us. End quote. In short, while this excerpt is deconstructing the colonial gaze within fiction, the concept replicates itself daily, particularly in an era of social media, which exploits marginalized movements and individuals by showcasing their trauma and abuse, either as a tool to harness support and/or as a continual form of dehumanization. Think of it this way. If we were to see white activists treated with the same violence Indigenous land defenders and water protectors face daily, there would be an uproar. When white women go missing, there is a collective societal push for justice. When Indigenous women, femmes, and Two-Spirit people go missing, their humanity is lost, their loved ones ignored. In order to get the dominant society to care about issues related to colonization and people of color, we, as a white supremacist settler society, repeatedly demand to see marginalized people put their bodies, their lives on the line, to see the horrific violence play out, and then we still do nothing about it. Just something that occurred to me, so it's not a fully well-formed thought, but yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, right? If you think about like what people consider of a cause worth supporting, right? Like it wasn't until people were seeing that front line at Standing Rock with the No DAPL movement and people being pepper sprayed and drugged into jail and put in dog cages and all the things that have happened, that's what caught the attention of the dominant society. And even then, it was still mostly Indigenous folks spreading the word, right? But still, there was a lot more support after people became aware and after celebrities showed up and stuff like that. So it's kind of like, it shouldn't take it that far. I mean, Indigenous people have been expected to put our bodies on the line quite literally for hundreds of years and continue to do so because we have to. But it would be great if we didn't have to do that as much for our issues to be taken seriously. And so I think about that sometimes too, about like how certain causes are legitimized based on what's happening to people's actual bodies. And it's quite damaging if you think about the long-term health effects too of the pepper spray or even some of the things that can happen if you're getting beat down and stuff, and not to mention like the trauma and PTSD that people have from some of these actions that they've had to take just to honor treaties or protect water or to protect our lives. Yeah, it's pretty intense. Yeah, I'm just going to be thinking about that for a little bit too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, because it also ties into how capitalism forces us to use our bodies as a source of labor, right? And that also ties into ableism, where it's like, if you can't use your body as a mechanized form of labor, then you can't be considered a worker, right? And so yeah. I think it's important to make these connections because it is all tied together. And I think oftentimes we, especially white activists, even if they're marginalized in other ways, get stuck in their little bubble of like, we're against ableism and we don't really see anything outside of that. So how does disability and Indigenous identity and advocacy relate to environmental justice?
Yeah, so if you think about, there's a lot of long-term health impacts that people haven't thought about as like disability. One thing more recently that I've been thinking a lot about is the impact of like chemicals and the chemical sensitivities. And that's something I experience, and what it does to my body is it can start being really extreme and take like days. And depending on how long I'm exposed to something, it can take over a week for me to feel less pain and be able to focus more. And so it's very impactful. And I'm thinking about how much like toxic dumping has happened in Indigenous communities, right? And how much exposure to things from uranium mining in certain areas, or the water contamination because of mining or pipelines leaking or whatever is being dumped in there. And that has started to enter our bodies in different ways. I don't think there's very much out there about like other than like cancer and those rates and stuff like that and how that impacts people. But some of the other things, I know that some things that are tied more to birth defects have been studied, but some of these things that would be considered newer, like there's not as much out there about the connection to things like with the chemical sensitivities and what that does to people in relation to Indigenous communities specifically. But it's not something that you can just be like, well, that's just like made up because like we experience it and suffer the consequences of it. And so that's something I think about with the environmental activism in particular, or even access to healthcare. I wasn't able to get one of my health needs met until I had the right kind of insurance to be seen. And even then, it took like 3 tries to find somebody to find out what was going on with me. And it was the same for another one of my conditions as well, where I'm like, it took me years to find a doctor that I can get a workplace accommodation for like not having Sharpies out and stuff like, or for people wearing a ton of cologne so I can participate fully. And I think that goes back into what you were saying about like the capitalist piece of it. Like we're expected to bring our bodies to do this work, but if you can't do it because you're exposed to something or because your body isn't able to do the task at hand as it's expected, then it can impact your career. And so I was faced with like, I just have to sit through and endure this so I can work, so I can continue to support students that and do the work that I love and that's needed on campus. But it was like deteriorating me physically as well, being exposed to these things. And so for it to take years to get a doctor meant that I needed to have the insurance to see that type of doctor. And so I think about the access to that in Indigenous communities, how there's not always the specialty treatments or certain types of physicians are employed at this clinics on reservations or in the tribal urban clinics and stuff like that, where you're not getting the kind of access to health that you may be able to. And it's all just interconnected. And so it's like, it is environmental, but it's also tied to like a healthcare access too. But a lot of the needs are caused by exposure to certain things environmentally as well. And so there's all these overlaps, and it's just a lot to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a lose-lose situation to a certain extent, because you mentioned like putting your career on the line. So it's like you have to sacrifice your body in order to make a livelihood. But in doing so, then you are like, in order to stay alive, but then in doing so, you're also possibly shortening your lifespan and or creating other long-term health issues down the line. And so it's definitely a tricky thing to navigate. So when you were trying to access healthcare was that through clinics on a reservation or what was that insurance situation like?
I didn't grow up on a reservation. My tribe doesn't have one in particular. And I guess I grew up near one because my stepdad's reservation is close to where we grew up on the coast here in Oregon, over in Slats. And I have access to the clinic there, of course, too. And also when I worked for Grand Ron, accessing their health clinic as an employee. And my kids have most of them have gone to tribal clinics as well. And I'm really thankful for them. And also we need more at them as well for tribal communities. And so before, the kind of coverage I had didn't cover what they would call alternative medicine. So like finding out like what was going on with my skeletal issues and what was causing like my chronic pain didn't happen until like 3 different chiropractors to finally find out what it was. And so like having access to coverage that would allow me the amount of visits needed to come up with like a treatment plan to lessen pain and to help manage it wouldn't have been possible without that. I wouldn't have been able to afford it. And so that's where that healthcare access came from.
So, I mean, then we've kind of already talked about this, but how does tribal communities being under-resourced, that's kind of a phrase that we hear a lot, how does that manifest in terms of accessing specific healthcare resources if you have to rely on what's within your community, such as, you mentioned alternative medicine or non-Western medicine?
Yeah, I think some of the tribal clinics are definitely shifting in like who works there and what kind of treatment is being received, but they're still very under-resourced, and that has a lot to do with not upholding treaties fully on the government side about like helping fund them or expecting the tribe to give the bare minimum to somewhat meet some of the treaty obligations, but expecting the tribes to be the ones to help support the clinics as well. I know that it's a priority for most tribal communities is the health piece, because that helps keep the tribe going and helps take care of their people. But there is definitely not as many services available. So a lot of times people have to get contracted out, like they'll refer you out to a specialist to get seen if they cover it, but not all tribes do that. It just depends. Just like anything with Indigenous communities, the answer is always it depends, because there's like 574 federally recognized tribes that have their own systems and their own government structures. So there's going to be a different answer depending on what community we're talking about, but some access just is not even available. So for example, one of my daughters needed braces, and we called her tribal clinic in California, and they don't even cover braces because they considered it cosmetic, but they're also underfunded too. And they don't have a lot of resources or ways to help support that clinic. And so that's just one example of many that can be given. So it's the access and the travel time. Just because you get a referral out doesn't mean you can make the trip sometimes for some families to a specialist. And it's just really unfortunate because the longer folk have to wait, the likelihood that whatever is going on with them is going to worsen, or if they are trying to navigate life with a disability, and there's ways to help navigate that a little bit smoother for them, or in ways that may lessen, like if you have chronic pain, and not just like through like ibuprofen 800s or anything. So if there's other ways to help, I don't know, it's just really sad. And I wish there was more help out there for the tribal communities in the ways that they deserve.
Well, there's also definitely something to be said for the fact that, like, and this expands past tribal communities, but the fact that medicine that's more holistic, such as chiropractor or acupuncture or things like that, are considered like a privilege, while definitely Western medicine, something like an ibuprofen can be very helpful when you need it. All the way up to things, like vaccines. But the fact that it's easier to get something from a pharmacy than it is that something that's more holistic also definitely has long-term effects on all of us. If healthcare isn't profitable, then you can't do it.
Well, it's even called alternative too, right? Like it's not looked at as like the primary or I'm really glad that there are tribal communities that are bringing in more like traditional plant medicine stuff. And it's not a lot, but there are some. And so I'm really thankful for those kind of teaching coming in. But a lot of that has to do with being able to make it into medical school and be able to practice in a community. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And then it's not like the majority of folk that are able to bring that in because they may not have been taught that. So I'm excited for the future in that regard to bring in some of those traditional teachings and everything. And also just like being able, like back to the whole part about being able to talk about disabilities too in Indigenous communities. I think if you think about the legacy of colonization that we're still living in, it's treated Indigenous communities so horrifically. And people were institutionalized for having disabilities across different communities, and especially in Indigenous communities, as when it comes to either if it has to do with something like living with PTSD or what would be people would be thinking of a visible disability. A lot of times people were institutionalized, and it's just really sad. And so I think that the fear of that still exists, of what has been done in the past. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think about that too, about the criminality associated with being disabled too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I know that that's something that's talked about in the long-term health consequences of intergenerational trauma, right? Like, and that manifests in physical ways, in emotional ways, in mental ways. And so it's definitely something that's important to discuss. And since you brought up institutionalization, I know that that's something that's come up more with the residential schools being kind of uncovered, I think more so in Canada than here yet, but I know that just Oregon specifically. And so, how do you pronounce it?
Chimawa.
Yeah. And so that's something that, while not new information to Indigenous communities, is new information. I also don't know how much I want to say it's new information when I think a lot of it is just us looking the other way as white people, as settlers. But that also ties into that history of mental illness and things like that.
I mean, part of why it's not talked about as much here is because the US hasn't acknowledged it. I remember seeing somebody's post and I was like, that's so true. Like basically the only schools that were designed to have graveyards in them, right? Like what they would call residential schools, which were, some people feel they had a good experience in them, but the overarching is it was pretty bad. And there was young people that resisted as well, of course, in these contexts. And so tied to activism as well. But the loss that happened there, not just the loss of the bodies of the physical kids and youth being lost due to disease or abuse and trauma or just plain murder. There was also the loss of culture and language and the long-term effects that you're talking about with the generational trauma and the legacy of substance abuse and some of the other things that came along in domestic violence. It's like this huge tip of the iceberg conversation. And part of it is the US has not even come close to reconciling that. I think with Deb Haaland launching an investigation is a huge step. I was doing some research recently and they don't even have, like the Library of Congress has maps of pretty much everything, but they didn't even have a map of all the schools. And I didn't even know how many there were until this boarding school healing project that's headed by Indigenous people, of course, has compiled the list. And there's like hundreds of them that were in the United States, not in operation anymore for the most part. There still are some, like at Chemawa. Another one on the West Coast is in Riverside, Sherman. But in Canada, they do have the Truth and Reconciliation Act where they are working on that. Canada is by no means perfect, nor do they treat their Indigenous communities well either and violate treaties as well. So they are still a settler nation in that regard, of course. But they have taken that step to say, like, this was bad. This was really bad. And we need to do something to start this healing project with the First Nations of Canada. And so that's where there's a disconnect in the US with that because the government has not even acknowledged it for the most part outside of Deb Haaland.
Right. That also speaks to how much of it is so intentional, right? Like in order to create this much harm on this much of a scale, it has always been and continues to be intentional. The way that we are taught in schools is, like, oh, all of that was in the past, right? And that not only disrespects the fact that that harm is still ongoing and still intentional, but it was always framed as like Indigenous people no longer exist, right? And so that erasure of Indigenous communities is really intentionally harmful, even if it's at first you think like, oh, well, we just don't talk about it. How is that harmful? And it's like, well, because it manifests in all these other ways and it's not spoken about because the government is creating all this harm and perpetuating all of this damage because we are still illegally occupying stolen land. That hasn't magically changed. It's not like that somehow goes away after a few hundred years. Residential schools, the pleasant name given to the extermination camps in which Indigenous children were kidnapped from their nations and families and tortured, are a crucial part of the history in how colonizers established this settler state. While this has only recently begun circulating public knowledge thanks to social media, it is not new to Indigenous communities. A 2016 article published by Al Jazeera exposes how the Chemawa Indian School, located near Salem, Oregon, was one of these camps. Quote, Marcia Small used ground-penetrating radar to survey beneath the cemetery on the Chemawa Indian School campus near Salem, Oregon. As she worked, she prayed to the children, even though her Northern Cheyenne language would sound foreign to them, because the children buried in this earth had been brought to the school from reservations and tribal lands throughout the western United States. Small, 56, conducted the survey using ground-penetrating radar as part of her master's thesis research at Montana State University. In the school's historical records, she had found autograph books from the 1890s in which children wrote private messages to each other. Please remember me when I'm in the grave, one boy who was renamed Danny Boone by the school staff had written to a friend. As she soon discovered, the tragic death of childhood friends was likely more common for Chemawa students than previously believed. In her thesis, A Voice for the Children of Chemawa Cemetery, which she completed this fall, Small reports that her surveys indicate there are possibly hundreds of unmarked burial sites at Chemawa, which is one of the last operating government-run Indian boarding schools. Government and church-run boarding schools were created under the infamous, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, end quote, approach. Captain Richard H. Pratt, a U.S. Army veteran of the Indian Wars, opened the first boarding school in 1879, saying, quote, transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit, end quote. His intention was the forced assimilation of the Native American population through the elimination of their language, customs, and culture. By 1926, government officials estimated more than 86% of Native children were attending the schools. Many of the children were forcibly separated from their families and ancestral lands, and many suffered brutal physical, sexual, and emotional abuse at the schools where they were converted to Christianity and coerced into abandoning their indigenous cultures. Quote, our homelands are the places where we're taught everything, where we go to feel full and heal as indigenous people, Small said. For these children to be buried in an unknown land with an unknown prayer, I can't think of a more horrific fate, end quote. Small's research was published just a few months before the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report on December 15th, the conclusion of a 7-year examination of that country's parallel system of residential schools. The commission declared that the practice constituted cultural genocide. Its research elucidated an often untold dark chapter of Canadian history and provided recommended steps for healing and recovery, to include reparations for residential school survivors and a revamped state history curricula that tell the stories of Indigenous people. Small's work is a stark reminder of how far behind the U.S. lags in addressing and even committing to fully documenting its own boarding school history, which remains relatively unknown to the general public. Government records indicate that epidemics of tuberculosis, trachoma, and influenza often swept through overcrowded dormitories at the boarding schools, where children were often malnourished and exposed to germ-infested conditions due to inadequate funding. While it was common boarding school practice to send near-death children home before they died, most schools did and still do have cemeteries. There are more than 200 documented graves at the Chemawa Cemetery, and Small came to her conclusions by comparing the shapes and sizes of unidentified electronic signatures in her GPR data to the areas of known burials. Quote, "It's remarkable what she's found. So many children were shipped away, and parents never were able to see them again," said Denise Lajamodir, president of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and an assistant professor in educational leadership at North Dakota State University. "There is a great deal of unresolved grieving in our communities from what we lost to the boarding schools," Lajamodir explained, who has been interviewing boarding school survivors since 2008. And she is among the Native leaders, researchers, and elders who believe the boarding school effects reverberate in their communities to this day. The challenges many tribes face, from high rates of substance abuse disorders to the loss of language, can be at least partially connected to boarding schools. Quote, "Loneliness, the feeling of abandonment, and then many of the kids were malnourished and abused, sexually and mentally. Our research is indicating that there can be an intergenerational basis for disease disparities from this trauma," said Lajamodir, whose own father attended Chemawa. "But it's America's best-kept secret," Lajamodir said. "It's not in the history books. Sometimes we don't know about it in our own families." End quote. In her dissertation, Small refers to the boarding school effect as soul wounds and urges the federal government to create state tribal advisory boards to oversee boarding school cemeteries and provide funds for ceremonial protocols to be conducted. In contrast, the Canadian courts allocated more than $60 million to the commission, which conducted a 7-year investigation. These included many truth-telling events throughout the nation that more than 9,000 residential school survivors attended. The commission will also create a research center that will safekeep residential school documents and foster continued scholarship. Native American law experts say one reason a similar process has yet to happen in the United States is due to an idiosyncrasy of the law, relatively short statute of limitations for civil suits involving abuse cases. In Canada, said Don Wharton, senior attorney for the Native American Relief Fund, no such limitation existed on residential school victims, and the lawsuits seeking damages were starting to gum up the legal system. This forced the courts to deal with the issue, leading to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that established the commission. The Office of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs declined to comment for this story, but Charles Rosel, director of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Education, BIE, said that even without a federal truth and reconciliation process, federal Indian schools are seeking to address the past by establishing schools for Indian students that build culture, language learning, and tribal sovereignty into the curriculums. Of the $130 million proposed for the BIE's 2016 budget, Rosel said there would be a significant increase for tribal language programs. Quote, "Indian education has a dark history, but now is not the time to dwell on it because it's an exciting time," he said. "We're redefining what education is and what success means for Indian students. We're ensuring the Indian voice is heard and that the culture and history is taught and respected." End quote. For Small, her fight for the children of Chemawa is also inextricably tied to the modern struggles of Native people. An Oregon Department of Transportation plan to build a cloverleaf exchange at an Interstate 5 exit would be less than a football field from the cemetery and could potentially disturb the remains of the Chemawa children, she said. Quote, "There needs to be a voice for the children. They need to have the prayers and ceremony to go to the next camp," Small said. "But people act like the cultural genocide never happened. But as long as this gets swept under the rug, it will continue." End quote. Then kind of talking again about intentional harm. During our first conversation, you mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. Could you share what this is and, if comfortable, your ties to it?
Yeah, so the MMIW movement really started in Canada as well. And it was Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people really at the front line of that work and bringing awareness and calling for a national investigation, which Canada did launch, surprisingly, but they did. And they've made some work going forward on that. It has spread down to the United States as well, and also to Mexico. And a lot of times what's happening with MMIW is it's looking at the United States and Canada and not talking about Mexico. But there's a lot of work being done to kind of push back on that. And some of the work I'm involved with is around that. And basically, what's going on is Indigenous people are having to do their own investigations, basically, because for at least the cases that, well, most of them actually, so like the cases that happen on federal lands or tribal lands are under federal jurisdiction, and so there's not all of them get taken up. So when somebody goes missing, it has to be reported as a federal case because of the Major Crimes Act. So again, like structural things in place that make this kind of stuff possible. And a lot of times people will say, oh, that person, so-and-so is a party girl, or they just probably ran off, and use a lot of stereotypes about Indigenous women to justify their disappearance. And so the disappearances are not investigated very well. The Department of Justice, the most recent stuff I've seen, declined around 70%, 70 something percent of the cases that are sent their way, which is a lot. And so that creates this kind of, I don't even know what the right word is right now. It creates this idea in the minds of dominant society that Indigenous women can go missing and nobody cares. And so that doesn't just happen on tribal lands, it also happens off tribal lands as well. So that it happens in the cities and in rural areas, urban areas, all over the place. And so what the MMIW movement is doing is trying to really raise awareness about the structural issues that exist that make it possible, and also to like literally find people. And so some of the work that I'm on the board with MMIW USA, which is based out of Portland, Oregon, and a lot of the work they do specifically is to help with ground searches, because people are like having to do their own searches because they're not being helped by law enforcement. So raising funds for those searches so people have gas money and they can eat, and they don't have to choose whether or not they eat or if they try to find their loved one. Like nobody should have to do that. They help with recovery of deceased folk who are found dead, with funeral expenses and recovery to bring them home to their families so they can be put to rest. And they also help reunite in the awesome instances where somebody is found. They help reunite them with their families or to their communities, and also try to set them up with that, because there's a lot of trauma associated with being taken and having to be brought home by somebody that helped find you. And so there's a lot that they do. And so supporting the families and supporting those, trying to find those that are missing, is at the forefront of the work and should be. And there's also the other part of it where it's helping create policy and infrastructure change at the federal level and at the state level that will help address this crisis that's been going on for over 500 years. I call it a 500-year plus crisis, and I really thank Sarah Deer for helping people not call it an epidemic, because that kind of shifts the responsibility of all of us into like addressing it. So that's pretty much what it is, like an overview of it. And it's not like there's one single person that's in charge of MMIW work. It's like widespread, continent wide. And so there's going to be pockets of people doing this work in different areas, which is really great because we need everybody helping.
Well, and again, it also speaks to how little the cops do to actually help people. They don't exist to do that. They exist to continue the establishment and reestablish the settler state.
Well,
That's
the other
awesome.
thing too, that's an issue with like the law enforcement side, is like people get misgendered and misraced. And so like the data on trans women is really rough because people get misgendered a lot, either by families that aren't accepting of their identities and or by law enforcement. And so some of the work that MMIW groups are doing is really important for, especially for trans women, to be found and to be seen and honored and everything. And then the other part that happens is people get misraced. So like if somebody is found, they don't necessarily say like, oh, that person's probably Native. Like if they found me, I'm not enrolled with a federal tribe, they're like, oh, she's probably, they would say, I don't know what she is, maybe Hispanic, we don't know. Or somebody might be lighter, they're like, oh, I think that person's white, or I think this person's black, or we're not sure, maybe they're Asian. And so there's kind of like this assumption made when they do find bodies, and then they don't match them against the databases properly. And so I know there's been cases where people have been found like in the Yakima area, and they've had people for like over a year before they finally made the connection. Family shouldn't have to wait that long. So it's just really some of the structural pieces, again, is helping educate law enforcement too on like what it means to gender somebody on a binary and what it means to just make assumptions based on phenotype. There's some of that work too, but I'm not as involved with that. I do help with some of the part about helping with the inclusivity piece with Two-Spirit relatives as well with MMIW USA's work. And they do a prevention program too for youth, and it's inclusive. So that's great.
So to kind of go back a little bit, when we were talking about accessing specific non-Western medicine, and you mentioned more traditional medicine, something I wanted to bring up too was how that also ties into environmental justice in terms of the displacement from traditional lands. And so environmental justice in terms of how climate catastrophes and capitalism are destroying so many natural plants and ecosystems, and how that ties into traditional medicine as well.
Yeah, that's a great topic. You see that happening here in the Pacific Northwest, and you see it happening all over, right? I don't want to speak for like try to do like a over general answer either, but what I will say about that is that the exploitations of plant medicine is very real, and so is the climate impact. It's pretty bad. And so like being able to access certain medicines and plant medicines is becoming harder for a lot of communities. I live far away from my ancestral lands in Santa Barbara, and I grew up primarily up here on my stepdad, who helped raise me in this area on the coast, and to learn a lot about the plants up here. But when I do go to California to visit my homelands and family down there, we would try to gather California white sage. And we've been able to do that, me and my kids, for several years. The last 2 times we went down there, we could not gather it. And a lot of that has to do with the fires that are a result of climate change, and also the exploitation of California white sage. Like, it's very trendy. People are like, oh, I'm gonna sage, and it also has like the antibacterial properties, like that science has proven that indigenous communities knew was there, but now it has like this scientific backing of like smudging is good for your health. And also a lot of people really crave that connection to earth medicine, and they really want something to help like cleanse themselves in other ways too, a lot of times. And so there's a lot, and it's a bummer when I see California white sage used outside of its cultural context. It's okay to share medicines, but it's not okay to exploit them. And so if I see it for sale, I usually ask people where they got it, because I want to know. And I tell them, I can't even harvest that like how my ancestors have for thousands of years, because it's over harvested and packaged and sold. I went to TJ Maxx. This was, I guess, before the pandemic. And they had California white sage packaged up in this plastic thing with a little, price tag on it. And my daughter brought it to me, and she was like, why did I bring that to you? My older daughter, because she knew I was going to say something. I looked on the back, and it happened to be from Oxnard, California, which is Chumash territory. I was like, oh, what? And so I told them, I was like, can you please pull this? Any of the other sage, like it shouldn't be sold, and gave them the spill. They were really cool. They pulled it. They should have gave it to me, but they didn't. But like, honestly, they should have been like, we're sorry, we stole your medicine. Here, you can have it, and did a write-off on it. They didn't, but I'm glad that they did pull it. And it's just really frustrating when I see it packaged in that way. And it's like, it felt so weird to hold sage bundles with plastic between it and know that nobody did an offering for it. And it was, who knows how it was harvested. And sadly too, my dad passed away this last spring, my dad in California, and he had been trying to find me sage for months to mail, because he would mail it once in a while to Oregon for me, and he couldn't find it. All his sage spots that he would go to that he taught us where they were at are all gone. And so hopefully they grow back. But between, like I said, between climate and capitalism, that's becoming a threatened plant that has like medicinal and spiritual properties with it. And so I think about that. So that's a really long answer to say like it's messed up.
So what is something, and again, this is a big question, but what is something you wish more settlers / white people knew regarding any of the issues we've discussed today?
Let's see, that is a big question. I wish that more people would take the time to learn more about, like, that this be a starting point for folk if they haven't heard about these issues. And if they have already heard about them, take time to continue to learn. And I hope that people have heard of at least one of the things we talked about. If not, that's okay too. We're all on our different paths, right, of learning. But I do hope that people do take the time and understand, like, as overwhelming as these topics may feel, like Indigenous people live them every day and live them simultaneously. So we covered some pretty intense topics. There's a bunch more that we didn't cover. And we live them every single day. And some of us a little bit more closely than others, but it's also our shared reality and our shared responsibility to understand like how this all works and how it impacts Indigenous communities. And yeah, I just hope that people do take that time and understand like it's not a other topic too.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think this is something when you exist at the intersection of multiple marginalizations, you can't just talk about one topic. Like if I were to talk about, my queer identity, it would also tie into disability just by the nature of the fact that I exist at that intersection. So yeah. It's definitely, existing. I like what you said about, experiencing it all simultaneously. So on that note, then, are there specific resources or organizations you'd like to encourage listeners to check out?
I think just finding out who the local Indigenous community is from wherever folk are calling from, and not like just calling them and saying, hey, do you have needs? Like look at their web pages, see what they have going on, see what's open to the public to learn more about the people whose land you're on, I think is really important. And if there are specific things they're facing, so like the Warm Springs tribe, which is more in Central Oregon from where I'm at, was facing like a significant water crisis. So like knowing what might be going on, like somewhat locally, if it's not in the immediate tribal community, but a little bit farther out. There's a lot going in the Pacific Northwest with LNG lines, and there's a lot going on with like MMIW's work and a lot of other things. So just finding out what's going on, I think, is important from the local context. And also, I think that supporting Indigenous communities means helping push things through legislation as well, like contacting senators. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, I don't know. And I'm like, yes, please contact senators and help get stuff pushed through. So thinking about the Violence Against Women Act has a whole section about MMIW. And I think that's part of what's stalling it. And that expired a few years ago at this point and has been reintroduced. So like getting certain pieces of things put through that'll help address some of the issues we've talked about. And then just finding out organizations that are supporting the different issues we talked about. So if you're looking at supporting MMIW work in particular, I would advise listeners to make sure they know what the organization does, if it is an organization, and if it's supporting through buying merchandise. This is something we didn't talk about, but make sure that the money is going to an MMIW family or organization. It's being exploited really heavily right now. It's really messed up because people are profiting off of ongoing genocide.
Is that the orange shirts?
That's the orange shirts are the residential schools, which are also being exploited now too. The MMIW merch usually is red. A lot of times there's a red handprint and our hashtag MMIW on it, or No More Stolen Sisters, or MMIW2SG and all the other ones that go along with it. So just make sure, like, if you are wanting to contribute, that you know where the money is going to, because you may be accidentally contributing to somebody's income from somewhere way far away or somewhere close that's just exploiting instead of the ones who need it. And I really appreciate how Deborah Maytubi from MMIWUSA described it as like, they're not stealing from like the organization, they're literally stealing from the families, because that money goes to the families and it goes to those searches.
If you're interested in learning more about the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, femmes, and Two-Spirit people, go to mmIwhoismissing.org or nativejustice.org. If you want to support the movement against the Enbridge Line 3 project, go to stopline3.org or follow Lakota Law and Wet'suwet'en_checkpoint on Instagram. Links for these will be in the description below. In addition to Life as Activism by June Jordan, this week's recommended book is The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth by the Red Nation. The link to purchase this book can be found in the episode description, or check it out and support your local library. Thanks again to Dr. Lahui Whitebear for speaking with me. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOSIL. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, we are occupying stolen land.